Hi, I'm Jessica, one of the guides for Free Tours by Foot, and today I'm taking you on a tour of Canterbury, one of the most important cities in the entire country. It's only 1 hour away from London on the train, and for me, this is the perfect day trip. This is the best place to come if you want to see Roman ruins, medieval crooked lanes, and of course, the iconic Canterbury Cathedral. So this small square outside the main entrance of Canterbury Cathedral is called the Butter Market. And you can see here in this image on the pub nearby what the Butter Market used to look like with a big covered roof. This memorial in the center of the Butter Market is for World War I, commemorating World War I. But a little bit later on the tour, I'm going to show you the scandalous statue that used to be here instead. Now, before this was the Butter Market, it was called, in the medieval era, the Bull Steak. And that's because, and steak, S-T-A-K-E, although it was connected to making steaks, the other spelling, because bulls would be chained to posts in the center of the square here and then whipped, because it was believed that this practice would make their meat even more tender. So of course we think about Canterbury as being mainly a medieval town, a Tudor place, and even a Roman settlement. But that's not to diminish the fact there is also a lot of Georgian and Victorian architecture here, and really every age of British history is represented in these streets. If you look just behind me here, you can see something clearly from the 1950s. Now, why are we talking about this strange little building while we're here in such a magical city? Well, this building actually is a clue to something that happened right here on Burgate in 1942, which is known as the Canterbury Blitz, or the Canterbury bombing. This area was really heavily bombed by the Luftwaffe. However, there was a slight silver lining to the aftermath of these bombs. So I don't want to diminish in any way the horror of the bombings that took place in Britain during World War II. Some of the cleanup revealed hidden treasures that had been buried beneath streets all over the country for nearly thousands of years. And that is certainly the case of what happened here in Canterbury. A lot of the Roman history of Canterbury, which was called Duvernum Canticorum under the Romans, was lost beneath the streets and pavements. When the Blitz hit these streets, it revealed Roman ruins, beautiful tiled pavements, mosaics, and lots of other discoveries, so much so now that there's actually a Roman museum here in Canterbury that you can visit to learn more. We'll visit the external walls of the city a little bit later on, and some of those walls contain Roman bricks. Wow, look at this stunning view of Bell Harry. That's the name of the tower at Canterbury Cathedral. And don't worry, we're going to visit it a little bit later on. This is Butchery Lane. A few minutes ago, at the beginning of the tour, we talked about the bull steak, tenderizing that meat. Well, here's where that meat would be sold. I like to stop here on Butchery Lane to point a few things out. First of all, we have a Shepherd Neame pub, which is a pub chain in the UK, and it's called the Shakespeare. Quite naughty to call something the Shakespeare here in Canterbury, because Canterbury is famously the birthplace of Christopher Marlowe. Some say that he was a rival of Shakespeare, and some say that he actually helped Shakespeare edit or even write many of his plays. We're going to talk a lot more about Christopher Marlowe a little bit later on. I also get a kick out of something like this, where you have an old building housing something very modern for Canterbury, a sushi restaurant, of course. I might get some sushi there after. So this is a very famous building here on Mercery Lane. And by the way, this particular house dates to the 13th century. Now, the theories as to why the building gets wider as it gets taller, some people say it's purely for status, that to have a building like this would have showed off that you had the wealth to have such elaborate architecture. Other theories state it's because you were only taxed on the land that your building occupied right on the ground. So you'd get more square footage if it went wider the taller the building. Those reasons are probably a mix of both. There is a common reason given that is most likely an urban legend. You may have heard people say that the buildings are wider like this so that you could dump your chamber pot out the window. In fact, we even get the term loo, a British term for toilet or bathroom today, because of this practice of throwing out a chamber pot of liquid and shouting "Prenez garde l'eau," or "Look out for water below," which turns into "Gardy-loo" and turns into loo. Now that's probably the case in Edinburgh. That's where that expression originates. However, the idea that people were dumping pots full of poop out the window is a complete urban legend. Maybe you could get away with a little bit of water, but you certainly weren't going to be dumping human solid waste out the windows. In fact, there was a whole profession, night soilmen, whose job it was to collect this and put it into cesspits or dispose of it in the rivers. So even though it's a very grisly and gross origin story for these windows, it's not actually true, but I won't tell anybody if you continue to keep believing it. Let's have a look at another detail on this building. My favorite things in all of Canterbury. In fact, I might even take a photo and have this framed on my wall, because this very unhappy and this very happy, let's call them gargoyles, on the side of this building are original to the house, we think, and they are almost a form of grotesque. Normally you see carvings like this on the exteriors of churches, and usually associated with some pagan beliefs and rituals that they were scaring away evil spirits. But in this case, they appear to purely just be decorative and maybe for fun. This, by the way, is called a corbel, a decorative part of a building, and usually they're just line work and design work. These are just extra special. Just look at the way his little fingers are laced together and the mischievous smile on his face. However, for our ancestors here, those cloven feet and horns tell you that he's definitely up to no good. So here, we're at the site of the former church of St. Mary Breadman. This church was demolished in 1901, but the site here dates all the way back to 1160. Now, when you're walking past something like this, you always know that you're standing on some ruins or archaeology, especially of a Christian church, when you see just some tombs and graves in the square. And this one here is particularly of interest because it features a memento mori. It's a skull. And seems quite a strange thing to put on someone's grave. Why would you want to evoke that slightly sinister imagery? Well, memento mori basically means remember death. And this is so that we, while we're here on earth, remember that our time here is short, and we remember to act accordingly for the health and benefit of our immortal souls. So remember death and behave. So here we have an example of a very modern brand and business existing within an older building. You can see Cafe Nero, which is a British-Italian coffee chain. Normally, all their branding is bright blue, but to stay harmonious with this historic building, they've chosen to be a little bit more dull in brown. Now let's talk about this building here at 41 High Street. Despite the fact that it says 1573, the building actually dates a little bit earlier to the 1400s. 1573 is just when it got this facade up on the first floor. If you look right up to the top, you can see that it got another facade added on its jettied second story. This one added in the late 17th century in 1698. I just love to see that. We've got 15th, 16th, and 17th century all on one building. So this building is often referred to as the Queen's Chambers. I think it says right there, Queen Elizabeth's guest chamber. But we're not talking about Queen Elizabeth II, of course. We're talking about Queen Elizabeth I. Reportedly, some people say she slept here, while other people say she didn't actually stay here. She just had a meeting here with a French duke. So there is a term called megalophobia, which is the fear of large buildings. And you'd be forgiven if while walking down High Street in Canterbury, you experience a little bit of megalophobia, because the Beanie Institute is really imposing and large. It's not actually that big a building. It's mostly because it's so much bigger than the scale of everything else around it. The street is quite narrow, and so when you see this behemoth in front of you, it can feel a little bit intimidating. Now, this is a Tudor revival building. I talk about on a lot of my tours how the Victorians were really fascinated with Gothic and Tudor architecture, and they really liked to recreate it. For an example, of course, just look at the Houses of Parliament or the Royal Courts of Justice. And this is another example of that in action. The Beanie Institute was built by architect A.H. Campbell in 1899 to house the Canterbury Library and Museum. And it was done so on a bequest of a private citizen from Melbourne with the last name Beanie, hence why it's called the Beanie Institute. Today, it houses a museum, the tourist information point, and the ever important public toilets. So until just a few years ago, Canterbury didn't actually have a statue of one of its most famous sons. In fact, there was no statue of Geoffrey Chaucer anywhere in the entire country, and so they've remedied that with this statue designed by Sam Holland. This larger than life-sized statue of Chaucer is kind of lording over High Street, and he's in a very good location. Directly across from him is Eastbridge Hospital. Now, if you look at this building behind me, covered with Kentish flint stone, this is not what you and I might think of as a hospital today. This is where we get some of the etymological origins of words like hostel and hotel, because this was a place for the pilgrims coming to Canterbury to stay while they were here. They were on pilgrimage, of course, to the site of St. Thomas Becket, which we'll visit a little bit later on. Now, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is about these kinds of pilgrims, but of course, he wants to make it as entertaining as possible. So he tells all kinds of raucous and downright bawdy stories, especially for the 14th century. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales about 30 pilgrims gathered in a Southwark tavern in London on their way to pilgrimage here in Canterbury. They were telling each other really outrageous tales with the idea that the best story would win a free dinner. So there was a lot on the line for these hungry appetites. The stories are still as entertaining today as they were more than 600 years ago, and I really recommend reading them or watching them. There's some good cartoons online. So in just a second, we're going to get our first view of the River Stour, which is a very important river for Canterbury historically and even today. Here you can see the infamous ducking stool replica, replaced a few years ago after the original finally rotted away. You'll often hear this stool referenced as a way to test for witchcraft by swimming them. A suspected woman would be placed in the stool and then dunked into the water. If she floated, she was guilty, and if she sank, she was innocent. Not to mention most likely dead. However, as good as this story sounds, it simply isn't true. Not when it comes to this dunking stool. It was far more likely have been a way to punish scolds. I would have definitely been here. That's because swimming accused witches was a custom more commonly used in the north of England, and experts here at the Christ Church University in Canterbury believe that the previous stool was also probably a replica mocked up in the late Victorian or Edwardian period to delight tourists, just as it does today. So it may be a replica of a replica, but it's still a very interesting relic of days gone by. So just behind me is the Weaver's House, established in 1500. But you have to remember that something else really important happens here in 1538. Henry VIII destroys the shrine to St. Thomas Becket. This is during the dissolution of the monasteries after Henry VIII founds the Church of England. And veneration of a local homegrown saint like St. Thomas Becket, an integral part of the English Catholic Church at the time, doesn't sit well with him. As we're going to see a little bit later on, he destroys the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and this town loses its major draw. Remember, with the time of Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, thousands, tens of thousands of people are coming here on foot as pilgrims every year. When the shrine is gone, this practice stops for a time. Its resurgence happens a little bit later on. But during the 16th century, in the 1560s, 70s, 80s, Canterbury is revitalized by immigration from Belgian Walloons and French Huguenots, both fleeing persecution for their Protestant beliefs in Catholic France and Belgium. They go to other Low Countries, and they also come here to England, where they found an extremely prosperous silk weaving trade. You can also learn more about this on our tours of Spitalfields. That's why this is called the Weaver's House. So right now we're walking down All Saints Lane, and when you look at houses like these, you really do feel like you've stepped back in time. But believe it or not, these were almost demolished as recently as 70, 80 years ago, and they've been saved from demolition. You can see the traditional wattle and daub style architecture. Most of these houses date to the 13th and 14th century, some of them a little bit older. So it is very special that they've been saved. And it's another good example of why you should always look up, look down, and look around when you're walking through a city like Canterbury, because you'll never know what you can discover when you go down a side street. Here's one of my favorite statues in the UK, definitely my favorite in Canterbury. This is Kitty Marlowe, and the reason it's called Kitty Marlowe is because Christopher Marlowe, the playwright who was born in Canterbury in 1564, his nickname was Kit. And so she, this lovely ode to the arts, is called Kitty as a nickname, and sadly the bush behind her is kind of growing into her face and she's covered in a few spooky cobwebs. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about this statue because back when we were at Buttermarket, I mentioned that the current memorial that's there is rather new. Previously, in the late 19th century, this statue was erected in Buttermarket. Now, have a quick look at the statue and you'll see why that was so shocking. She's bare-breasted, and yes, this is kind of a Greek-Roman pastiche, a nod to antiquity and to the muse of theater, but she was bare-breasted in notoriously conservative Victorian England outside of Canterbury Cathedral, the most important church in the country. Yeah, it did not go over that well, and eventually it was actually Sir Ian McKellen, who is the patron of the Marlowe Theatre, who spearheaded the campaign to bring the statue here and take it out of obscurity. So thank you, Mr. McKellen. Sir Ian, I should say. Along the plinth are statuettes of characters from one of Marlowe's most famous plays, the tragical Dr. Faustus. By the way, Christopher Marlowe is the source of a lot of conspiracy theories. We do know that he was gay. We know that he was acquaintances with William Shakespeare, and some people even say that he is the real mastermind behind all of Shakespeare's genius and plays. That's really highly unlikely, but he did have a tragic end. Marlowe was stabbed to death in a bar fight in Deptford in London, another southeast London pub connected to Canterbury's history. Quite strange if you ask me. By the way, both the Southwark Tavern and the Deptford pub that Christopher Marlowe was killed in, they're both gone now. The Marlowe Theatre, as you can see, a very modern building, and it is hosting world-class arts programming. This is not the only theatre in Canterbury. For a city of its size, it is dedicated and committed to the arts. There's a huge theatre complex here, Curzon Riverside, and the Gulbenkian Theatre. So this is a place where you can see plays, musicals, Christmas pantos, and even concerts by international bands. So this is called Bulkhead or Mask. It has two names, by sculptor Rick Kirby. This was part of a temporary sculpture programming in 2003, but everybody loved it so much they decided to permanently buy it and place it here on the banks of the River Stour, just behind the then new Marlowe Theatre. What's really lovely about this is that it pays homage, even unintentionally, to that history of theatre with a mask. So much of the original fortress walls around Canterbury have been removed in different eras to make way for modern roads and for traffic. And this gate behind me is the last and most elaborate gate that remains. So the wall that you're seeing surrounding the city, some of it does still contain Roman bricks. And the Romans built this wall as early as the 3rd century CE. This gate, however, West Gate, is much younger, about 1,000 years younger. This dates to 1370. However, it is one of the finest examples of a medieval gate that survives in the UK and in fact all throughout Europe. So behind me here is Conquest House, and this building is where the 4 murderous knights are said to have gathered and plotted their premeditated murder of St. Thomas Becket. So if you only walk down one street while you're in Canterbury, the natural, obvious choice is High Street. And don't get me wrong, it is loaded with really interesting buildings and history. But I much prefer Palace Street, not only for Conquest House, but also for the Crooked House a few steps away. So here at the end of Palace Street is my personal favorite building in Canterbury, the Crooked House. This was built in the late 17th century, but a little more than 150 years later, it really caught the eye of Charles Dickens. And some people say that it inspired a famous quote from David Copperfield. A very old house hanging out over the road, leaning forward, trying to see who was passing on the narrow pavement below. That's really epitomizes Dickens' way with words, because the building really does look like it's kind of peeking over here onto the side street. Just like the corbels we saw back on Mercery Street, you can see that this building too also has beautiful decorative corbels. Well, beautiful or scary, I'll let you decide. He also has cloven hooves, which was the style at the time. The shop has changed hands many times over the year, but today, very fittingly, it's a used bookstore. You can see how crooked the doorway is right here. Palace Street also has a second name, the King's Mile. This is because here, after the death of St. Thomas Becket, Henry II proved his penitence for his role in the murder by walking a mile down this street towards the shrine at Canterbury Cathedral. He did this with bare feet, wearing a sackcloth to show that he was truly sorry for what had happened. Just above my head, you can see a red diamond with a white horse that says Historic Building of Kent. The white horse is actually on the Kentish County flag because it symbolizes the victory of the Kentish people over William the Conqueror, except that's not 100% accurate. William the Conqueror, when he arrived to English shores, pretty much ignored Kent, even though we had this very bountiful agricultural land, many lords and important people. William the Conqueror and his men basically strolled right past all of them. The important men of the day chose to take this as a bit of a compliment. They chose to say, yes, he did not even attempt to conquer us. No, he was just more interested in London. But as a result, Kent to this day still says it was never conquered by William the Conqueror, and its slogan is Invicta, for victory, along with this white horse. So this junction, where four of the most important streets in central Canterbury meet, is often referred to as 4 Points. Now, there's some really interesting shops and businesses here that we can see. First, straight ahead, this kind of hippie-ish, lovely fair trade shop, Siesta, but that's not what I want to talk about. Look directly above the door and just to the right-hand side, and you see a red pump, water pump, attached to the side of the building. That's because this square was historically known as a place where you could buy sweet rushes. What are rushes? Well, rushes are long, tall, dried grass like bulrushes that would be collected from nearby aquatic areas and dried and sold to people who used to use them as the flooring for their home. It sounds quite unhygienic, but it was actually a way to keep your house smelling nice and in good condition. You would put down rushes, and over time your animals that might be coming in and out of the house, maybe welcome like a cat, unwelcome like a rat or a gerbil, would leave droppings and things, but instead of sitting on the floor, those would naturally shift down to the bottom of the pile of rushes. Same thing with dirt. Over time, sand, dirt, silt would slowly filter down, and over a few months, half a year, or even a year, the rushes would become flat and trampled down, and it was time to replace them. This is where you could come buy your rushes, and a lot of times they would be cleaned and rinsed with the water from this pump. It was said to give off a rusty red color. The water was red that came out of the pump because of the iron oxide in the groundwater nearby. And so here is a pump that reminds us of the history of the area. Now, just behind us, just over here, we can see there is the American Pancake House. This is such a brilliant reference to the fact that it has a connection to the Mayflower. It's really hard to go anywhere in England without finding somewhere that claims it has a connection to either the Titanic or the Mayflower, and this is no exception. It was here that financing for the Mayflower, which brought the first pilgrims to America, financing for that trip and that boat was both sought and approved. You can go have some American-style fluffy pancakes while you're here too. So despite the fact that this plaque says it was built in 1503, it was actually built in 1480. I don't know why that mistake has been immortalized there, but this is another Charles Dickens reference. We know Dickens loved Kent. Today, Kent can almost act as a bedroom community, a suburb of London. I live in Kent and commute into London to do my tours, but back then it really was a pastoral country place where people from the big, dirty and chaotic city could come to pick hops and earn some money, or come on a idyllic countryside vacation. And that's exactly what Charles Dickens is doing. He famously passed through Canterbury on his way to one of his favorite places for rest and relaxation, which is Broadstairs on the Kentish coast. This inn he loved so much, he immortalized it in David Copperfield. The Fudge Kitchen is open, and I know that I've lived here in the UK for long enough to truly be British, because I cannot go on a little day trip like this one without getting some fudge. So let's go inside. Guys, if you could smell this, I'm not even a big chocolate fan, but the smell is intoxicating. I have to go inside. Hi. Oh my goodness, I'm not even a chocolate fan, and now I am with that smell. I had to come in.
Chocolate sea salt at the moment.
Okay, I'm gonna get a piece to take home for my husband and I to share. Now, you might think for a city as historic and historically important as Canterbury that it would be a time capsule, a little jewel box stuck in time and preserved with nothing modern allowed. That's not the case at all. Canterbury is a bustling modern city. It's home to 4 universities, and it's a place that people come for entertainment and leisure, as well as for historical tours. Behind me here you can see a very modern high street. Why I like to point this out is because every generation before us has used Canterbury in the same way. The Tudors, the Georgians, the Victorians, they all made Canterbury into what they needed it to be at the time, just like we've done now. So this is Canterbury Cathedral up close. You can see Bell Henry, the tower, from almost any point in Canterbury and the surrounding countryside, but it's only once you come through the gift shop and pay your admission and come into the grounds that you can see how absolutely massive this church is. Now, if you're a British resident and you pay for your admission, which is £14 for an adult, it's actually good for an entire year. So hang on to your ticket and you can use it. I think this is my third or fourth time here already, so I'm really getting a lot of value out of my admission. Now we're going to enter into Canterbury Cathedral right now, but by no means is this going to be an exhaustive tour of everything that there is to see inside. If you'd like to see a more detailed video about Canterbury Cathedral, let us know in the comment section below. Now here we are in the nave of Canterbury Cathedral, considered one of the finest examples of perpendicular architecture in the country, if not the world, built by Henry Yvel from 1377 to 1405. Now just look at that amazing ceiling. You really do feel tiny when you're standing here. Remember, Canterbury Cathedral is much older than this, dating back to 597 AD, when Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great to reintroduce Christianity to England, was welcomed to Kent by Queen Bertha and King Ethelbert. It is the most important church in the country, other than maybe Westminster Abbey, because this is the religious home of the spiritual head of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury. For the past 1,000 years, he has crowned the monarch, something very much in the news recently when this task fell to the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Now here is one of the many, many stunning examples of stained glass here at the cathedral, some of which date back to between 1130 and 1160. However, this piece is much younger, depicting great monarchs in history from Queen Bertha, the first notable Christian convert in England, to Queen Victoria. You'll also see many effigies, funerary sculptures of important people here in Canterbury Cathedral. This is an impressive example of Sir John Boys, who was a steward to 5 different archbishops, and he died in 1612. Now here's another grand effigy, and there are so many, and I have a few more coming up. This one is the effigy to William Warham, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1503 to his death in 1532. He was actually the last to hold this position before the Reformation. We even have a Hans Holbein painting of him. Remember, if you like strange artifacts and effigies, make sure to watch more videos here on the Free Tours by Foot channel, and check out my own channel, which is called The Museum Guide. It's linked below in the description. Now, Warham's tomb is located in a very special place in the cathedral. It's just in front of the small, modern altar that marks the spot where Archbishop Thomas Becket was murdered on 29th December 1170. Now, I'm going to give you a brief overview of his life and death, but for a more detailed account, watch my colleague Margaret explore Dover Castle in the video linked just above. On the night of St. Thomas Becket's death, 4 armed knights, believing they were acting on the orders of King Henry II, attacked him with their swords while he prayed here. Thomas Becket was a London merchant's son, and while he was still a wild youth, his closest friend was Henry, who was later to become Henry II of England. When Henry ascended to the throne, Thomas became his trusted chancellor. Now, Henry II was getting frustrated at all the special privileges afforded to the church, which had its own courts and laws. By installing Thomas as the Archbishop of Canterbury, he thought he could gain control over the church. However, Thomas appeared to undergo a religious transformation, and he became more and more pious and devoted to God. All of a sudden, he was no longer willing to go along with Henry's wishes. Things got tense, and Thomas fled to France for 6 years. When he returned in 1170, he excommunicated some important bishops and was heard to shout the words, "May they all be damned by Jesus Christ." When Henry heard the news of this outbreak, he is said to have uttered, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And that's where those 4 knights come into play. They thought they could curry favor with the king, and they rushed to Canterbury and savagely murdered Thomas Becket here on this spot, cracking open his skull with their swords and dashing his brains on the stones, where it now reads Thomas. Now, Henry was so horrified at the news of his old friend that he became determined to repent. He donned sackcloth and ashes, as you can see here, and starved himself for 3 days. He then canonized Becket in 1173, and the shrine here at Canterbury Cathedral soon became the most important centre of pilgrimage in all of England. This candle is where the shrine used to be located. However, it was completely destroyed under Henry VIII in 1540. The king ordered all of Becket's bones to be destroyed and all mention of his name eradicated. Today, an official shrine is now in the crypt, but filming is forbidden there. I highly recommend that you visit when you come here to Canterbury. Now, as we head up these stairs, we see even more beautiful stained glass and the paschal candles used for Easter. Our penultimate effigy, this one of the famous Black Prince Edward, son of Edward III and the father of Richard II. Depending on which sources you read, he was either a great war hero or a criminal during the 100 Years' War between England and France. His nickname, being called the Black Prince, might derive from the armor that we see so richly detailed here, or it could come from a massacre of civilians he led during the siege of Limoges in 1370. The Black Prince didn't die on the battlefield. Instead, he died of dysentery at Westminster in 1376. He dictated his tomb preferences from his deathbed, that he should be, quote, fully armed in plate of war. His effigy was made from complexly plated bronze, and it was completed more than 10 years later to bolster his son Richard II's waning popularity. I love gazing up at the replicas of his surcoat, helmet, and gauntlets hanging above the effigy, and the originals are downstairs in the crypt. Finally, let's have a look at the effigy and tomb of Edward the Black Prince's nephew, King Henry IV, and his wife, Joan of Navarre. Henry IV, now most known for Shakespeare's riveting dramatization of his life, had a turbulent reign punctuated by religious and political turmoil, ultimately leading to the Wars of the Roses. He and Joan of Navarre are buried here beneath these fine alabaster effigies. Behind me here are some very different stained glass than what you'll see in the rest of the cathedral. And that's because these are quite young, dating to 1956. They were created by an artist called Ervin Bossany, who was Hungarian. He fled his homeland in 1930 to escape fascism, and the church commissioned him to make these stained glass pieces inspired by Hungarian folk art to commemorate people killed and persecuted under fascism and at times of war. Here we can see a candle here that is kept eternally lit. The candle burns perpetually as a reminder of prisoners of conscience and those who suffer unjustly for their beliefs. This is the cloisters, a place that not everybody knows they can visit here at Canterbury Cathedral. This was originally built in 1399, and it was used as a way for monks to travel from building to building within the church complex and monastery without having to really go outside, although it is open air. If you look up at the ceiling of the cloisters, you can see 876 different heraldic shields, of which 576 of them are different. They represent different institutes, families, and churches across the country. Most people visiting the cloisters wouldn't notice this small hole here, but in fact, it was used as a place for the monks to sell beer to the outside world. Just like in Trappist monasteries, a lot of people know Belgian beer, a lot of it is brewed by monks. Historically, monks here in Canterbury would have been brewing beer as well. And while they were in cloister or in solitude from the outside world, this was a way that they could sell that beer. I like this here, the wheat, a little reference to the pagan past of the Church of England. Of course, the Church of England, like churches anywhere around the world, have enveloped and included parts of pagan rituals and pagan religions that existed in the area long before it. Wheat is a very big part of both British pagan traditions as well as many traditions around Europe. So here is the monks' herb garden, which today is over the site of their dormitory, their living quarters. The monks did grow herbs here. They were an extremely self-sufficient bunch. They not only brewed beer, which I mentioned before, but they baked their own bread, cooked undoubtedly delicious fresh food, and they grew a lot of herbs, both to flavor their cooking, but also for medicinal purposes. We also have a 12th century remnant of health and hygiene here as well. This octagonal building just jutting off the side of the main cathedral is a water tower that was originally built here to ensure that the church, the monks, and the other members of the clergy had clean drinking water. So here in the gift shop, we actually have a wonderful example of the Canterbury cross. The Canterbury cross was discovered in the mid-19th century in an archaeological dig, but it represents an Anglo-Saxon brooch that was found here dating to around 850. Ever since the late Victorian period, it's been used as a symbol of Canterbury and of Canterbury Cathedral. So look out for it when you're here. So this is the war horse, the Canterbury war horse. And it's a recent piece of art, a collaboration between the Canterbury School of Visual Arts and the cathedral. And it commemorates the more than 8 million horses that died during World War I, British horses, many of them making their way through Kent to the continent. It's very sad. So before we end our tour, I want to show you just 2 more important places that are within the grounds of the church. Here we have the entrance to the Old Palace, and you can see that it's private. The Old Palace is the official residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury whenever he's in town. He doesn't actually stay here that often, as the most important person in the Anglican Church, other than King Charles III himself, he's got a lot of busy engagements both in London and of course around the world. But when he's here in Canterbury, this is where he'll stay. Now just here, I wanted to mention one other important thing. We've got our 2 longest reigning monarchs on either side of this entrance, both women. Over here on our left-hand side, we've got Queen Victoria and of course her prince consort, her beloved Albert. But much more recently, you can see the different color of the stone. We've got somebody who's been on our minds a lot lately. Of course, this is Queen Elizabeth II, looking extremely beautiful here, and her beloved prince consort, Philip. So I think this is the perfect way for us to end our time at Canterbury Cathedral. Well, that's the end of our tour of Canterbury for today. I hope you've enjoyed walking around this magical medieval city as much as I've enjoyed showing it to you. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave me a comment below with other videos you'd like to see. I also have my own channel called The Museum Guide, so I'd love to have you as a subscriber there. For now, that's the end of the tour, and I hope to see you on your own pilgrimage to Canterbury.